Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm going to be talking about episode 2 of season 5 of Star Wars The Clone Wars called A War on Two Fronts. Now, overall, I think this is mostly just an alright episode, but to me it's really the lore aspects that we get to see in this episode that really have me excited. So let's dive right into it. And the really exciting thing is the location of this particular story, and that is the setting of the planet of Onderon. Now, if you are a fan of the two Knights of the Old Republic games like me, I've played them both. I've got KOTOR 1 on my computer right now. My copy of 2 is on a disc back in America. But anyway, I love KOTOR 1 and 2. My favorite is actually 2. I'm a little bit of an anomaly that way. But anyway, the reason that Onderon is indeed from KOTOR 2. And it is interesting that here in this episode we are told in the backstory that there's someone who is considered the legitimate king of Onderon, and then there is the guy who is considered the phony king of Onderon by, at the very least, the rebels that Lux is thrown in with. Now, this very much parallels, in some ways, the story from the video game, in which you had the rightful queen of Onderon by the legal standard, and then you had her cousin from the military who thought she was doing a lousy job of running the planet, was basically trying to shore up power to seize control of the planet for himself. And of course, as you play the game, you can influence events to determine who indeed ends up becoming the undisputed leader of the planet Onderon. And it's a pretty good storyline from that video game. I really enjoyed my time on Onderon. I mean, just talking about it really makes me want to go out and play Knights of the Old Republic 2 again. Just a fantastic game. Now, granted, that game is all set somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 4,000 years before the events here in the Clone Wars. But the Star Wars galaxy is a galaxy where nothing much ever really changes. So anyway, so I did like that they really are hearkening back to the game for the storyline here. On the other hand, that's also a little bit of a problem. I mean, if you're going to go and do a story on this planet, can I see something new? I mean, this is just what I said. The Star Wars galaxy never really changes. Here we're basically looking at possibly seeing the same thing as we saw in the game. Now, granted, in the game we were following, the Jedi exile as the lead character, so we got to see things on a much more personal level. Here we come in definitely with a side on the side, and basically the side that we're going to be on is chosen. Well, you can choose sides in the game, but of course it's a TV show, not a game. And it's like I was complaining about earlier. We have seen the whole. No, wait, I wasn't complaining about this earlier. What am I thinking? I'm sure I'm thinking about another review I did. Okay. What I'm saying here is we're getting another episode like we got on Fallujah, where the Jedi have to go out and train some guys to fight off the bad guys. Now, granted, this is a slightly different situation than what we saw on Fallujah. On Fallujah, they were basically taking completely untrained farmers, and that was what they had to work with. The insurgents on Onderon do have some experience. They do have genuine gear and all this other stuff, but they're not absolute beginners, but they have a lot to learn. So let's call it that. And it just sort of feels in some ways like we're seeing a rehash of that story. But ultimately, though, the whole thing with the politics of what seems to be going on Onderon seems to be more or less, at least in this episode, in the background. Our primary focus is on what's going on with our characters, specifically, mostly with Lux and Ahsoka, but I'll get to that in a little while. One thing that I do want to bring up that was mentioned in the conference with the Jedi is what exactly are the Jedi's role in all of this? And the question that gets raised basically is, what is the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter? The Pretender King guy who dresses an awful lot like the Alderaanian nobles in the Star Wars The Old Republic game. I just have to point that out because, seriously, they seem to be wearing very, very similar clothes. But anyway, the guy who's sitting on the throne right now is legally considered the legitimate king. And the person that the rebels are backing is considered a pretender to the throne. So it is a legitimate question. Who are the terrorists and who are the good guys here? Again, as I said, this is really the question of where is the line between your terrorists or our freedom fighters? And do keep in mind, just because someone has allied themselves with the Confederacy does not automatically mean that they're bad. I mean, look at Lux. Look at his mother. Look at all those other people that we saw on Raxus. Those were people, seemingly good, genuine people, who bring up extremely legitimate points about the unfair treatment that some worlds suffer in the Galactic Republic, about the seemingly never-ending corruption in the Galactic Senate, and is it really any wonder that some of them might decide, you know what, the Galactic Republic isn't working out for us, let's go and try and form our own interstellar government. And again, the Republic is basically trying to stop what would be the equivalent of, a bunch of nations leaving the UN. I mean, can you really imagine a war breaking out over that? I think it's even been said a few times that if they do this, then the economic ramifications would just be absolutely enormous. So if you really stop and think about that, isn't it kind of like basically just a big war over money that we're looking at here? But you know what? That's for larger debates on the Star Wars universe. Let's focus back in on what we're seeing here in the story. Now, I do like that during the little training session with the Rebels, we get to see Rex specifically mention that he is a member of the 501st. If you are familiar with the greater Star Wars lore, you know that the 501st Legion are ultimately the stormtroopers, the very best of the best that the Empire has to offer, who are the personal contingent of the Imperial military led by Darth Vader. They are, as I've said, the best of the best. It is those guys that go with Anakin to the Jedi Temple in Episode 3 and help him massacre the Jedi. After having watched, Clone Wars and the Gennady Tartakovsky Clone Wars and all this other stuff from this time where we really get to know these characters like Captain Rex, it really is just heartbreaking to think that that is ultimately what's going to be the fate of so many of the clones that we see. They're either going to die in this war, or they're going to become just tools of the Emperor and Darth Vader. And one of the things that the shows have done repeatedly is really drive home that clones are not. The clones are individuals. They're human. They have their own personalities and thoughts and opinions about things. And knowing that they're ultimately doomed to either die or become instruments of evil is really one of ultimately the great tragedies of the Clone Wars. But anyway, as long as we're getting in talking about philosophical things, let's look at how it was mentioned in this episode. You always have a choice. I believe it was Rex who brought this up. But anyway, this is very true. This is, I think, one of the most important points in all of philosophy. Now, I'm not going to get really heavy on you here, but there's this French philosopher that you might have heard of by the name of Sartre. And just let me say right now that Sartre is considered an acceptable way to pronounce his name for English speakers. I was actually talking about this with a guy the other week, and he gave me a big smirk and pronounced it some other way and said, well, it's actually pronounced this way. It's like, dude, screw you. That's what I said is a perfectly legitimate way of saying the guy's name. and it's been a very long time since my high school French class, so, get off my case. Well, that's what I wanted to say. I didn't say that because, he's a friend of mine. I just was just being a little bit of a pompous dick at that particular moment. But anyway, to give you the very, very short version of one of the things that I like about Sartre is he basically says at one point, there is no such thing as you have no choice. If somebody comes up to you while you're walking down the street, sticks a gun in your face and says, okay, give me your wallet or I shoot you, then you do have a choice. You can give him your wallet, or you can not give him your wallet and have him shoot you. Now, most of you are saying, well, that's not a choice. Well, technically it is. And Sartre kind of goes on to say, you will always have a choice. You always have a choice. You just won't always have a choice you like. And to me, that is a very profound and incredibly true observation about life. I've noticed that a lot of people don't particularly care to have this pointed out to them, but that doesn't make it true. So, yeah, we always do have a choice in life, but the times when we have a choice that we like, well, those are never guaranteed. And it's certainly true in times of war when a lot of the choices that we have to make, especially ones involving life or death, are choices that really have no 100% good option. Now let's dive right into what's going on with the characters. Now this episode, Anakin and Obi-Wan are sort of in the background on things. Obi-Wan is the one who raises the objection to, or at least raises the question of, we're basically saying we're going to go out there and fight a legitimate government. How does this make us the good guys? How do we avoid turning these people into terrorists? And Anakin, of course, is just a little too eager to go out there and fight and kick butt and all that other fun stuff that we've come to expect from Anakin. But the real meat of all this story is the continued weird attraction between Lux and Ahsoka. And, I do find it very interesting that all three of our main characters on Clone Wars, Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, and Anakin, all do have some very weird romantic stuff going on. Obi-Wan has his relationship with Satine. I mean, he's even stated that if she'd asked him back when he was still a Padawan to have come with her, then he would have left the Jedi Order in order to be with her. And if you really kind of dive into the expanded universe, it is established that Obi-Wan actually, over the course of his life, fell in love with at least 2 other women. Interestingly, both of whom were Jedi. So, Obi-Wan is not a guy who is really as divorced from his passions as maybe he might like to present himself, is the way I've always looked at Obi-Wan. Now, Anakin, of course, is in that secret marriage to Padme. So, there's really not much more to say than that. Although, honestly, the more I read about the Star Wars Expanded Universe, the more it just seems to me that you really wonder why Anakin just didn't say, you know what, I don't want to live a lie anymore. I'm going to go and I'm going to join the Altesian Jedi. They're allowed to marry. Or, you know what, I'm going to move to Corellia and live there, because the Green Jedi, aka the Corellian Jedi, they're allowed to marry and have families and all this other stuff. Now, if you're not familiar with either of these organizations, they're basically splinter groups from the Jedi. And there are a surprising number of them out there if you really start digging around in the Star Wars universe. There's guys like those, the Jal Shay, the Grey Paladins. But anyway, so then we come to Ahsoka and Lux. Now, Ahsoka is, not quite there. I mean, she's not an adult, obviously. So there's just the nature of this show. There's going to be some serious limits as to exactly how far this thing with Lux can go. But, it is very obvious that the two of them are very attracted to each other, that they do have some genuine feelings for each other. And I think it's safe to say that this is going to be us going down the road of seeing Ahsoka struggle with this, with the idea that Jedi cannot form these attachments, these sort of relationships. And that is really, in many ways, very sad because, Ahsoka is a young woman. She's at that point in life where most of us really do genuinely fall in love for the first time. Ahsoka is 16 here, I believe, and I mean that's how old I was when I fell in love for the first time. And while that ultimately didn't work out, there are memories and feelings and emotions all associated with that time in my life that I would never want to give up for anything. When you first fall in love for the first time, I mean genuinely and truly fall in love for the first time, it is a very transformative experience. It is really amazing to realize that it is simply possible to feel that way. Love gives you wings is a very old, very cliche saying, but that doesn't mean that it isn't true. And part of the tragedy of the Jedi is that, for understandable reasons, they do cut themselves off from that. They have friendships, they have things that they do care about, but always they must avoid attachment, because attachment is something that can potentially lead into the dark side. And that's all very blatantly rooted in Buddhist philosophy, but I think we've had enough philosophy for the time being. But going back to the Star Wars video games, specifically the Old Republic game, to put it simply, it is possible for you to play a Jedi in that game and for you to get married. Now, granted, you're either skirting or blatantly breaking the rules of the Jedi to do this, but the option is there. And anyway, in one of the storylines for Jedi that do get married, there is basically your wife will send you can get married to one of these characters, and your wife will send you a letter, and she's also a fellow Jedi in the storyline of the Jedi Consular. That's what I'm speaking about specifically, where she basically says, well, the Jedi Council are always talking about how Jedi shouldn't get married because it leads to passion and attachment and all this other stuff. And she reaches the point that while that it might be true, the Jedi Council doesn't really consider the upsides of love and marriage for Jedi. Because marriage, she says, it teaches you things like patience and devotion and putting the needs of others before you. And frankly, I think that's a really fantastic point. There are certainly things to be gained from Jedi being able to pursue relationships. And it's even basically been stated by George Lucas that the reason the Jedi ultimately were destroyed is that they just became too orthodox, too unyielding. You know what? I think we need to pull back for a moment and just refocus in on what's going on here. Do forgive me, folks, if I do this. It's simply, this is the first chance I've really had to do reviews of Star Wars stuff. I love Star Wars. I love the Star Wars Expanded Universe. I love the games, the comics, and all that other great Star Wars stuff out there. And just having the chance to really talk about that stuff with you guys gets me super excited. So if I kind of go off on tangents, please bear with me. I will eventually come back to the episode. But anyway, so we have Steela and thought a soul patch was a good idea in terms of facial hair rebel guy whose name I don't remember. And there's obviously some jealousy and attraction going on between them and Ahsoka and Lux, and it's all just a big soap opera, really. Now, granted, we don't get a whole lot of our lovely little teen drama here because, this is only a 22-minute episode, and, they've got a lot of stuff going on. But I do like that they are taking the time to introduce that because it's simply an established, it's got basically an established fact of storytelling that while you can do all this, really crazy, fantastic stuff in a story, like Spider-Man or X-Men comics are, I think, really one of the best examples of this that I can really give. It's really the soap opera of what's going on with the characters. And by soap opera, I don't mean exclusively romance. The politics that are going on here in Clone Wars, the drama of what's going on with Savage Opress and Maul, that all plays into the soap opera, or should I say space opera, of what's going on in this episode, and in the Star Wars story in general. But anyway, let's move on to some more of the specifics regarding this episode. And one of them is either this is a hole in writing, or these Rebels guys are really, really worse than I thought, because the droid army is literally right on top of them before they noticed. I mean, do these guys not understand the concept of a perimeter? You know, maybe having some guys out there keeping watch to make sure the freaking droid army doesn't walk right up to you and shoot you in your own base? I mean, these guys seem to be reasonably well equipped, so, you know, how hard is it to set up a couple of motion sensors? But, you know, then we can't have our big dramatic battle, blah, 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 blah. You know, storytelling's trumping basic common sense is bit of one of my, it's kind of one of my pet peeves, I guess. Let's leave it at that. Now, I did like that they did show that the little Roger guys can genuinely be a threat, and we've seen this happen a few times. But I always like that when they do take those moments to remind us that these guys are genuinely dangerous. Now, not that I don't enjoy the comedy with these guys. I know that really rubs some of the people who like this show the wrong way. But personally, I get a big kick out of these guys. I think the Clankers are hilarious. But it is established in, actually, of all places, some of the Star Wars role-playing game put out by Wizards of the Coast, Star Wars Saga Edition, that droid commanders are actually extremely dangerous, because they can just up the coordination between even Clankers to the point where they're a serious threat. And I like that the droid commander that we see is genuinely presented that way. Now, we don't get to see a whole lot of these guys, and the good guys do take them down fairly quickly. But I don't think presenting these guys as, some sort of enormous threat was there. They weren't meant to be the major threat of this episode. They were there to basically throw an action scene to the kids. But I think all of this was there to remind us we can't take these guys lightly. I mean, look at how all the training was about how you can't take the droids lightly. And this is how the droids are dangerous. This is how you have to defeat them. This is how the only way you stand a chance against these things is if you can learn to work together. And I do like that. That, one, it makes for some nice drama, it makes for good storytelling, it makes for good character stuff, but it also really drives the point home that, the Clankers and their little friends might be a little silly, but if you underestimate them too much, then they can definitely kill you. And at the very end of it all, we're sort of left with, kind of on a cliffhanger, moving on to the next stage of this story. So, in terms of overall this episode, we're once again dealing with stuff that is primarily setup. But it's an exceptionally well done setup episode. As I've said, there's a lot of stuff to really geek out about in terms of the lore that's going on here. There's a lot of really good philosophical issues raised here. We also, of course, get the soap opera going on. So really, there's a very, very wide variety, a really great mix of various elements in this episode, and it looks like it's going to come together into a very strong, very well done story arc. That's all I really have to say for this episode. That's it being said, as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.